Okay, so in this Ed puzzle, we're going to talk about communication, how animals send signals back and forth, what is the purpose of signals, what are they hoping to accomplish, what kinds of information can be contained in signals, and how animals send signals, which pathways do they use. These often are the same pathways that they use to get information about the world around them, so perceptual pathways. So we're going to talk about the main ones that are used by marine birds and mammals. So what is communication? Communication is hopefully the transmission and reception of signals that contain information. So there's something in the signal that's being sent between the sender and the receiver. And we're going to talk about the difference later between a signal and a cue, because cues are also information. But cues are different from signals in that signals have been shaped by natural selection for effective transmission through the environment to the receiver, with the goal of causing the receiver to change their behavior in a way that benefits the sender. So another way of sort of thinking about this might be individuals are essentially sending signals to convince, manipulate the receiver to change their behavior, the receiver's behavior, in a way that benefits the sender. I'm trying to get you to do what I want you to do, right? Again, that could be, and that's, I'm sending information as a way of doing this. Now, there are those folks who also talk about the fact that signals are not necessarily only shaped to go through cognitive pathways, but they also may be exploiting emotional or motivational pathways. Whatever gets the job done, right? Whatever gets your receiver to change their behavior in a way that benefits you. If you can do that with a signal, then generally selection is going to favor that. Signals tend to be, compared to taking direct action, in a lot of cases less expensive. They are also often less risky. So if, again, it's a expedient way of getting your receiver to do what you want them to do. And animals use signals in a huge variety of contexts, that some of which we've already been talking about in this course. We were talking about sexual selection, and we're talking about same-sex competition. That involves an enormous amount of signals, right? I'm trying to demonstrate to my rival my motivation, that I'm fiercely motivated to defend my territory or to defend my group of females. I'm letting you know how strong I am, possibly my age, again, my fierceness level, right? My level of aggression that I'm prepared to bring to bear on you, right? And you just don't want a piece of this, right? Is essentially what those males are saying. Don't, be careful, think about it, right? Don't pull the chain unless you want the whole dog, right? And so that's information about the sender that they are deliberately sending to the receiver, with the goal of getting the receiver, in this case, to back down and go away, right? I'm trying to get the receiver to do what I want the receiver to do, right? And again, on average, we're not going to have time in this course to talk about deception, really, but there are situations where the receiver is essentially manipulating the sender. And you have unintended receivers, which we will talk about here in just a moment. What happens when you have eavesdroppers on your communication system. We were also talking about sending and receiving signals involved in mate selection and other types of sexual selection. So other than just same-sex competition, but also in mate choice. I'm trying to persuade this female that I am the best male around and she should choose me. And I'm going to send her signals that contain information about my overall health and general level of fitness and energy reserves. How good am I at getting food? Well, I'm going to demonstrate that with this very bright color pattern, or this very vigorous dance that I keep up for hours on end, right? Or a jumping display, or whatever, fill in the blank, whatever it may be. I may also be demonstrating how good of a parent I am likely to be by bringing nesting materials or food or other things in terms of trying to determine mate compatibility. So that's all information that the receiver can use to decide how they want to respond to the sender's behavior. And of course, we talked about earlier, there's a lot of pressure on the sender to cheat. And so therefore, there is selective pressure on behalf of the receiver to only respond to signals that they are confident are honest, and they're giving me honest information about the sender in this particular case. But signals don't always just contain information about the individual who's sending them. They can also contain information about the environment, such as alarm calls that are warning others, usually relatives, but not always, that are warning others about the location and possibly type of a predator or other source of danger. They could be actually communicating to the predator, hey, I've seen you, you've lost your advantage, give it up, right? So again, if that alarm call gets your predator to at least temporarily back off and go away because they've lost the element of surprise, then that's something that's going to be evolutionarily favored, right? It worked. Again, it could also be the information about the location about a food source. And again, sometimes we're going to talk about signals are sent deliberately by a sender to get the receiver to change their behavior. There are certain situations where foraging in groups makes sense, and so communicating information about where the food is benefits the sender directly, even though they have to share that food with others. They may be more efficiently gathering that food by sharing that information. Also, if you're hunting cooperatively, that's information that you need to share with your co-hunters so that you're likely to be more successful. So information and signals is again sent deliberately from the sender to the receiver. However, the intended receiver may not be the only individual that is picking up on that information. And we're going to talk about that more here in just a second. So what are the main ways that animals use to communicate? What are their main modalities or media? We have four main ones. Again, there are some animals that can tap into some alternative pathways, such as body heat or electrical sensors. But for most of the animals we're going to be talking about, certainly, we're dealing with four main pathways. So visual pathways, right? These are signals and cue information, as we're going to talk about the difference here in just a second, but information that's basically processed by some sort of photo sensor, either picking up flashes of light or movement or color. Those wavelengths of light are exciting pigments in some sort of photoreceptor, typically an eye that functions very much like our eye, and relaying that information to the brain. Another pathway, of course, would be sound. This could be sound that's vibrations in the air. It could also be vibrations in the water, or even through a solid. So you have animals that communicate by drumming or stridulation, which is basically we were looking at sage grouse, and they were picking their feathers with basically a little comb pick on their wing, making that sort of zipper noise, or the birds of paradise making the clicking noises. They're basically snapping their wings together, and so they're producing noise by percussion, essentially. So you can, again, anything that sets up a vibration in a medium that's traveling through that medium can be considered to be sound waves. And again, picked up by some sort of an eardrum-like receptor that is capable of detecting those vibrations. And then you have olfactory communication. So for the most part, we consider this to be your sense of smell. But a lot of what we perceive as taste is actually olfaction. So this is essentially chemical communication. And you may have specialized receptors for particular types of chemicals. For us, they're mostly receptors in our nose and our nasal cavity that are right on the other side of our mucous membrane, and they go right, the nervous impulses then go right into our olfactory bulb in our brain to decipher those signals. But in some other animals, those receptors are in other parts of their body. A lot of invertebrates, for example, have olfactory chemical sensors on their feet or on their antennae. to pick up particular chemical signals. We're going to talk more when we get to it about particular olfactory communication in marine birds and mammals, but it's often used in social bonding situations, may also be used in territory defense situations. So here we have an infrared photograph here, the last picture on the bottom of an African lion male and basically peeing on a tree. But in the urine, embedded in the urine, are a lot of chemicals that are giving the environment and whoever picks up those chemicals information about when he left the signal and information about him, so maybe his dominant status or his body size, things like that, essentially saying this is my spot, stay out. And those chemicals can often essentially can often last a really, really long time. They can often travel a good distance depending on how volatile they are, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then last, of course, mainly is touch. This is less important seemingly for a lot of bird species, although they do have some tactile communication going on that's involved in social bonding, particularly between parents and offspring. But for mammals, touch is quite often a really big form of social bonding and communication. So they use it all the time. Okay, so what's the difference between a signal and a cue? So a signal we've established, right, has been shaped by selection for its effect on the receiver. So it's information that's sent in a particular package, and that causes, when it's received by the receiver, hopefully, most of the time causes the receiver's behavior to change in a way that benefits the sender, right? So again, signals are containing information, but they're being sent deliberately by the signaler in an effort to change the behavior of the receiver. However, cues are typically information that's being sent as a result of an unintentional byproduct of either performing a required behavior, so you're moving around and you're unintentionally giving away your position because you're rustling leaves in your environment, you're bumping into things, right? Or you're swimming, that causes ripples in the water, and those are vibrations that can be detected by predators potentially, if they have the sensors to detect that information. It's information about your location. You don't necessarily want to give away that information, but you kind of can't help it because there are things that you have to do and you have to move, for example. Signals can also contain cue information. That's information that may be part of the signal that's being sent to the receiver. So maybe I want the receiver to know how old I am, possibly, or where I'm located. I want them to be responding to my location, either be attracted to my location, right? Or I'm giving them information about the location of a predator, and I want them to look at me to see where I'm looking as to where the danger is, right? So I may want to give away my location information as part of that signal because it's going to be important information for the receiver to have. However, it's also possible that unintended receivers can pick up on that information. And in that case, that location information, for example, becomes a cue to that unintended receiver, or who we refer to as an eavesdropper, whether it's a auditory, visual or chemical signal, and we still call it eavesdropping. I'm intercepting a message that is meant for somebody else. I may not be able to decipher most of the information in the message, and I probably don't care. I'm just picking up on the information that's relevant to me, that is being sent in that signal, possibly unintentionally by the sender, or possibly intentionally by the sender, as information that they want the receiver to have. But either way, that information can be intercepted by unintended receivers. So a signal that's being intercepted by an eavesdropper is considered to be a cue because they're not the intended receiver, right? You don't necessarily want them to have that information, and you're not trying to change their behavior in a way that benefits you as the sender. So some examples of cues again are owls that are listening for the movement of rodents. Those little harvest mice are out there rummaging for food. They have to physically move through their environment, and they're trying to be quiet, right? They're trying to be stealthy, but there is some information about their location that they sort of can't help but give away as just the fact that they're moving. Likewise, as we're going to talk about later on, polar bears have some of the best, if not the best, sense of smell in the entire world. And they're picking up on basically the olfactory information that is just part of a seal pup going about their business. So they may have nursed and there is dried milk on their face, right? That's a chemical that can give off an odor and be transmitted through the air. Again, not a signal, not trying to change the receiver's behavior. They also have musk glands that they use to recognize each other and for chemical communication between the mom and the pup. So the pup is producing, again, a chemical signal, but the polar bear is very definitely not the intended receiver of that particular information. And these are really, really, tiny chemicals, but they can travel a pretty great distance, assuming they get through the ice. So they're not going to be really high concentration. But for a polar bear, it's basically in a little contrail that they can follow to where that seal pup is. So it's giving away the location information, again, unintentionally, so that would be a cue. Okay, so coming up, I've got a little video clip of ground squirrels, California ground squirrels, in their ongoing evolutionary relationship with their rattlesnake predators. They're also gopher snakes that prey on ground squirrels, other terrestrial predators. They have aerial predators. Basically, they're the French fry of the food chain. Everybody likes to eat them, and so they have a lot of issues to deal with. But what you're going to see is an interesting interaction between the female ground squirrels are going to send some signals, and you can, again, pay attention to how the snake responds to those signals, and then pay attention to what the squirrels do in response to the snake's response to that. We're getting a back and forth. We're getting some interspecies communication going on, and they are what we can't detect with our eye, sending some deliberate signals aimed at the rattlesnakes, because rattlesnakes can pick up on body heat, and California ground squirrels have developed a special signal just for those rattlesnakes.
For some mammals, attack is the best form of defense. This squirrel is arming herself. It's a California ground squirrel, and she's found a snake skin. She's chewing it into a paste, which she then rubs into her fur, especially her tail. She now stinks of snake. She lives in a colony that extends across a wide expanse of prairie. There is one downside to this neighbourhood. It's in the middle of rattlesnake country. Not good when you have young to raise. Her neighbour has sensed something. A rattlesnake hidden right next to their burrow. They both investigate, but what can they do? Kicking stones only provokes the snake. Rattlesnakes sense prey by the heat they give off, and the squirrel is able to take advantage of this. She heats up her tail with warm blood. Waving it at the snake is a threat. It makes her look much larger than she is. And the scent of rattler on her fluffed tail intimidates the snake. It decides to retreat. The mother decides that this part of the neighborhood is too dangerous and moves her young to new quarters. With luck, this may be a safer place to raise a family.
Okay, so what did the tail flagging behavior by the ground squirrels accomplish? What was the goal of waving their tail around? Why do that, right? Well, probably one goal would be to get the snake to go away, quite possibly, right? Well, why would the snake go away? Well, you have that hot tail is going to make that ground squirrel look even bigger than it actually is to a rattlesnake. That is the heated tail they do not use with gopher snakes, because gopher snakes are not pit vipers. They have no ability to detect the hot signal, and it's just a waste of time. They still tail flag to gopher snakes, though. They just don't heat up their tail. So that big, basically waving tail is essentially a bit of a threat. They're trying to make themselves look as intimidating as possible. And you might think, okay, well, the ground squirrels are the food, the snake's the predator. How on earth is the squirrel intimidating? And the truth is that California ground squirrels, and actually a lot of other ground squirrel species that co-evolve with snakes, the vulnerable members are the babies. It's the pups. The adults not only quite often are immune to the snake venom, so if they get hit with a snake strike, they sort of shake it off and walk away. Not only that, but because snakes are such a threat to their offspring, the adults will often attack and kill their snake predators if they get the chance to do that. Or in the case of the video, right, she was taking the skin of the snake and sort of making a pulp out of it with her mouth and then spreading it all over her fur. So that's another, I'm borrowing smell from a snake. Again, that's a cue, but I'm using it to defend myself because now snakes are very territorial. So if they smell that snake, I might be like, well, hey, there's already a snake here. I need to take off, right? So that waving tail from something that looks a little bit bigger and could potentially attack me is somehow now an actual threat. So what's interesting is notice the snake's response. Kind of moved away. Again, it also, well, they're kicking the dirt in their face. The snake doesn't like that. Hey, I don't have eyelids. I don't have hands to get the dirt out of my eyes. That hurts. Don't do that. So you want to move your head away. The squirrels will continue to do that and basically tail flag and throw substrate, substrate kicking in the snake's face, typically until the snake leaves. But quite often, that threatening display by the snake triggers a defensive signal from threatening behavior on the part of the squirrel, triggers a defensive behavior on the part of the snake and gets the snake to rattle. Now the rattle, right, is the snake saying, it's a warning. Hey, keep doing what you're doing. Mess with the bull, you're going to get the horns, So keep doing what you're doing and something bad is going to happen to you. I'm going to warn you before I strike. You have to be able to back up your threat usually, but I'm going to warn you before I strike. The ground squirrels are actually trying to basically put those snakes on the defensive. Well, one, they want the snake to go away. That's the ultimate goal. But they also want to get information about how dangerous the snake is that they're dealing with so that they can assess whether they need to move their babies or not. And by getting the snake to rattle, which is again a defensive signal, and it's a warning, but there's cue information in that signal. So information that the snake is not intentionally trying to send. The ground squirrel is not the target, but it's eavesdropping on information that's in the rattle. Based on the rattle, the squirrels can tell the pitch of the rattle and how vigorous that they're rattling. That gives them honest information about how big the snake is. So the larger the snake, the lower the pitch of the rattle. That's, again, something they can't fake, and they can't avoid giving away that information. It's a cue. So that gives them information about the size of the snake. Larger snakes, of course, can pack a bigger punch with their venom, so they're more dangerous. And also how vigorously they're rattling, the speed of the rattle. That gives them information about the energy level of the snake. It is a warm snake or it's a cold snake, right? Because we know snakes are mostly ectotherms. They're getting most of their body heat from the external environment. So a warm snake can move much more quickly than a cold snake. So the most dangerous thing for these squirrels would be a big, warm snake, right? That would be, all right, we've got a problem. We need to move our kids away from this area, right? From this part of the meadow, get them someplace else, go through the burrows and go to the other side of the meadow and get away from this large, warm, threatening predator, potentially. Again, not to the adults, but to the babies. Once the babies are grown, it takes them a little while to be able to produce the antivenom proteins in their bloodstream. But once they do, then they're fairly safe. No, not completely safe, but fairly safe from a snake predator. They're also incredibly fast, and they can quite honestly usually dodge the snake strike. They will see it coming and anticipate it and essentially just tumble out of the way or jump out of the way, which is really spectacular to see actually on slow motion video. And again, if you're immune to the venom, you can still take a full strike of venom and walk away. So in deploying this particular signal, the squirrels are, again, the intended receiver is the snake. They're trying to get the snake to go away, but they're also putting the snake on the defensive and getting it to reveal information about itself that they can use to assess their next move. What should I do in response to this? So if you're the snake, one question might be, well, why even warn your prey, right? Why even warn them? Why not just strike every time when you're threatened or you're defensive? So that was a question I was going to pose to everyone. Why not just strike every time? Venom's expensive to manufacture, right? You don't want to waste it on every little thing. So again, if you can send a signal, and that's, again, less expensive than acting directly. It's typically safer than acting directly. If it gets you your desired results, that's something that's going to be favored by selection over time. If it benefits the individual that's sending it, again, typically it's a fitness benefit. It might be a small fitness benefit, but it's a benefit. So again, I have to be able to back up my threat. Otherwise, that signal becomes meaningless. But if it works in accomplishing the goal, and it's cheaper to rattle than it would be to strike every time. And again, you're not going to warn your prey when you're striking before eating, but typically when they do warn, when you hear the rattle, hey, something bad's going to happen. If you keep doing what you're doing, that's a defensive signal. Don't step on me. I'm over here. So you're giving away your location information. So whether information is a signal or a cue, the receiver needs to be able to receive and process that information, essentially perceive that information in order to be able to use it, right, to make decisions or gather information about their environment. And so to do that, right, you have to have receptors, whether that is a protein that binds to particular chemicals or a pigment that responds to particular light wavelengths. or a membrane that is sensitive to vibrations in a medium like the air or water. That receptor is then going to convert that stimulus information to nervous system impulses, and then your brain collates all of that stuff, and you get out of that, it's kind of a black box, to the sensation of perception of a particular stimulus, right? So in the case of olfaction, right, this is typically what we process as smell, but it also plays a huge role in what we perceive as taste, even though we only have 5 taste buds. And I'm not going to really talk about taste here. I'm just going to talk about, again, the chemical receptors. So for birds and mammals, this is typically found in your nasal cavity. There are chemical receptors that are responding to binding to airborne or waterborne chemicals. And those chemicals then bind to the surface of the receptor, and in doing so, the receptor shape changes, and that triggers a neural impulse to the olfactory bulb in the brain, and that olfactory bulb, of course, is gathering information from multiple receptors, and then, of course, can put all that information together to form a sensation and be able to recognize a particular chemical, right? Whatever that whatever kind of chemical that may be, and whether that's positive or negative or all those kinds of things is sort of separate. But you're processing chemical signals that are either airborne or waterborne, or coming into contact with your chemical receptors. So how far a chemical signal travels really depends on its molecular weight, which is also related to its volatility. So basically how quickly it evaporates from a surface and becomes airborne or waterborne. So typically smaller molecules are often used and deployed either as a liquid or are released into the air. A lot of insects use pheromones, for example, and those are essentially airborne hormones. So the molecules themselves are extremely small, and they can be carried, again, very long distances away from the sender. Now, this only helps you as a signal if your receiver can detect those chemicals, typically at very low concentrations, because as those chemicals are traveling away from the source, they're going to spread out, right? They're going to diffuse through the environment, and typically their density drops quite a bit, so it makes it harder to find them. But they can be good at sending a signal over long distances, again, if you have the right receptors for them at very, very low concentrations. And again, as an individual is moving, if they're continuing to release that chemical signal, that information could be used by the receiver as they're tracking changes in concentration to be able to follow the sender through the environment. Chemical signals that are typically used for territory defense or similar types of purposes are generally larger molecules that are heavier, and so they have less volatility. They will eventually, essentially evaporate, but it takes some time. And so this means they tend to stay put. And again, we'll be sort of emitting this very slow pulse of information over a really long period of time. So they last a lot longer, but they don't travel as far. They tend to be associated with a fixed position. And quite often the receiver has to come in pretty close proximity, and in some cases direct contact with the chemical signal itself in order to extract the information. So the chemicals are put into urine, or chemicals that are inserted into a waxy sebaceous secretion, such as our sweat glands, for example, or we have sebaceous glands that release oily substances, and those can contain chemicals that with again odorants that can be detected if you have the right receptors, right? If you don't have the receptor for that particular chemical, then you're not going to be able to detect that particular signal. So you can again have very heavy molecules that have low volatility, which are great for sending a continuous signal over time from a particular location. And they last a long time, but they don't tend to travel as far. Or you can have, again, very lightweight, volatile chemicals that travel really, really far, but then get dispersed over distance and lose their the concentration for that chemical signal. So it may be hard to detect, unless you can detect it at low concentrations. So chemical signals, yes, are used for mate attraction, to mark your territory, information about like ant trails, information about where the food is, or danger. A lot of species emit sort of warning chemicals, particularly fish. In the presence of a predator, they will release a chemical signal. And of course, chemical information could also be cues, right? I mean, it could be something that an individual has no control over, producing. Trying to think of an example. Oh, I know. So when zooplankton are eating phytoplankton, they give off a chemical byproduct of the process. It's something that they can't control. They're not putting it out there on purpose, so it's not a signal. But it's a chemical that a lot of marine birds are able to detect, and so they will hone in on areas where there's a lot of this chemical, because that's essentially telling them where the food is, and they're attracted to that particular chemical. Unfortunately, that's also a chemical that is produced when bacteria eat plastic, and they produce the same chemical, which helps explain why a lot of our marine birds are attracted to our garbage patches that are floating around in the ocean. Which brings us to visual information, right? So most folks hopefully know more or less how our eyes work, right? We have light that's coming in through the aperture in the front. They work very much like a camera. It's coming in through the front here, through the pupil on the left side of this particular diagram. It gets focused by the lens, and then the light lands on the retina at the back of the eye, and we've got pigments that are responding to particular wavelengths of light. When they are stimulated, they generate nerve impulses that then are generated through the optic nerve to our visual cortex of our brain. And then that information, of course, is then all collated and processed in our brain, and the result is an image. We perceive that as visual information. And again, it could be motion, it could be shadows, black and white, or it could be different colors in the electromagnetic spectrum, depending on which receptors we have for that. What I find to be terribly interesting is this is, again, a model here of a human eye, but it's extremely similar to essentially an octopus eye or a squid eye, or some other complex eyes, but in particular, octopus and squid are almost identical to our eye in terms of how they function. Now, the exact proteins involved are completely different because we're dealing with a totally different evolutionary origin, right? And the way they focus an image is also a little bit different. So we stretch our lens. Quite often, other species will move their lens forward or backward to help focus an image, and that helps give them a little bit of flexibility in terms of how they can process an image. And so one other thing that you'll also notice here, you've got this space in front of the pupil. This is the aqueous humor. That's basically, a humor means fluid. So there's a little bit of liquid in front there, and that's acting as a cushion for the lens. It's also in our marine species, things like that help to resist the pressure change. As you go down in depth, right, you have pressures pushing on things. You're experiencing 1 atmosphere and then 2 atmospheres of pressure, and so on and so forth. Their eyes actually get squished in. So as we're going to talk about later on, a lot of our marine mammals actually see better underwater because their eyes are adapted to being under pressure as opposed to being in air, where they don't have that pressure pushing on their cornea in the front and actually causing their whole shape of their eye to change a little bit. So with visual information, just like chemical information, you can only respond to a particular stimulus if you have the right receptors for it. So basically our perception of color and other things is directly related to the number and type of receptors that we have in our eyes, right? We are primates. Many primates actually do have full color vision, or what we refer to as full color vision, meaning we see red, green, and typically blues and yellows as well. We're trichromats. We cannot perceive ultraviolet light without, again, a black light. We're not an insect. Many insects are tetrachromats, and so they pick up ultraviolet radiation as well as visible light radiation. And many other animals, though, are dichromats. They may see yellow but not red, or they may see blue but not green. Some other limitations to what they can see. Is typically the colors that they can't see are perceived as white. So we have two main types of receptors in our eyes that are used for different purposes. So now later when we get to marine mammals in particular, there are a lot of deep diving marine mammals that actually use their rods and cones for slightly different purposes at depth because there's very little light available. And so cones, for example, that typically respond to colored light are not really used for that purpose underwater because there's no available light. So they use them actually to increase contrast. But our rods, again, are more sensitive. They are generally used for black and white, also help with motion detection, and our night vision. Again, our cones are typically used for color vision, but again, may be used for other purposes under other conditions, or may have evolved for different purposes under different conditions. Again, color vision, primates, a lot of fish, which is why a lot of fish respond to red colors. You'll see fish that are bright red color. Reptiles and amphibians typically have very good color vision, but most other mammals, surprisingly, other than primates, don't really have great color vision. So being dichromats and not being able to see red is actually pretty common in the animal kingdom. So there are several ways of producing visual signals in general, right? This could be a flash of light or again a motion. But if you want to produce color, most often what animals use are pigments. There are other ways to produce color, particularly iridescent colors, by using refraction, a layer of wax over the top of a feather, for example, with a melanin underneath. The melanin will absorb pretty much every wavelength of light, but the light has to pass through that waxy layer on top, and when it hits the melanin and any light that is reflected gets bent as it departs. And so that tends to separate it like a prism into its component. Take white light and separate it into its colored components, and so that gives that iridescent color, that sort of rainbow shimmer that we see with iridescent colors. You can also use a scattering or interference to produce different types of color. That's one way of producing blue without using a pigment. But as I said, most typically pigments are used. And these are just basically chemicals, mostly proteins, but chemicals that absorb different wavelengths of light. And what's not absorbed is reflected. So for example, we see most plants as being green because chlorophyll A and B, which are the photopigments that are being used in photosynthesis, absorb high energy electromagnetic radiation from the visible spectrum. So they basically absorb violet and blue light. They also absorb lower energy light with longer wavelength. They absorb essentially most of the red and orange and into some of the yellow a little bit. And so what's not absorbed, right, is reflected. And so the green is not able to be absorbed by chlorophyll A and B, and so that is what's reflected. And so that's the light wavelengths that are hitting our eyes and being picked up by our photoreceptors in our eyes that respond to the color green, right? So pigments, again, are just chemicals that absorb and reflect different wavelengths of light. Carotenoid pigments are typically somewhere in the red, yellow, and orange parts of the spectrum. Beta carotene, for example, is what we find in carrots, right? And that's orange. We also find beta carotene actually in a lot of leaves, and we're getting towards the time of year where you're going to be able to see them quite nicely as the chlorophyll A and B gets deactivated in anticipation of fall dormancy in a lot of our hardwood trees on campus, and the leaves start turning colors, and what you're seeing are the carotenoid pigments underneath the chlorophyll A and B that are being revealed. So I've mentioned a few times that there are limitations to perception, right? We can't detect a particular chemical signal if we don't have the receptor for it, right? We can't see a particular color if we don't have the receptors that respond to those light wavelengths. And so there are a couple of factors that are likely going to be limiting or affecting the perceptual capabilities of different types of organisms, animals in particular, and of course marine birds and mammals specifically, because that's what we're really interested in this course. And one of those factors, of course, is going to be your evolutionary history, right? So every organism sort of comes to the table with a slightly different bag of tricks, right? Things that have evolved due to past selective pressures and past available genetic variation, right? We know that selection can only act on variation that's present at the time. It can't create new variation just because it's needed, right? So you have a particular toolkit to work with, and that's all you have to work with, right? So this means that you, again, may have evolutionary pressures for complex visual processing, for example, a camera lens type of eye. And so selection may favor that, but you're likely going to be coming to that point from a different start point. And like we were comparing a vertebrate eye to an octopus eye, for example. And mechanically, they're extremely similar in terms of how they operate, but the proteins involved are vastly different. Octopus actually, as it turns out, do not have very good color vision at all, despite having this very sophisticated eye that processes visual information, very nicely. They get a very nice, sharp image, so they have high visual acuity, but they have poor perception of colors. They don't have the photoreceptors in their eyes to be able to accomplish that. So unlike us, which is again likely due to a separate evolutionary origin. They shouldn't have that in their toolkit. Otherwise, maybe they would have evolved an eye that was more like ours in terms of color vision. What blows my mind is the fact that they have visual pigments in their skin. They're embedded underneath the chromatophores. Those are the cells that are controlling the pigments in their skin that help them to change color so quickly to match their environment. And that was a big problem for the long time, was like, okay, they can match their environment so well in an extremely short period of time, but they can't see color very well with their eyes. Are you kidding me? And don't ask me exactly how scientists figured this out, but it was only within, I want to say, the last 5, 6, 7 years that we realized through various studies and experiments that the visual pigments were present, but they were under the chromatophores. And of course, what's really interesting about octopus and cephalopods in general is that diffuse intelligence. They have multiple brains, one per arm. So and they have a lot of nerve density in their arms. So it actually helps explain their ability to change color so fast. They don't have to send signals to a brain that then processes and makes a response. The response can actually be processed and implemented at a local level. Sorry, local level. I cut myself off a little bit on the previous slide. Sorry about that. I just get really excited about cephalopods. I just think they're really, really fascinating, interesting creatures in terms of how they interact with their environment, and they're just capable of so many complicated things, and pretty darn good for a relatively short-lived invertebrate. Okay, so other limits to perception, other factors. One is going to be your evolutionary history. Two is going to be their ecology, your current ecology or recent ecology. Basically, how an organism makes its living, what is it eating, where is it living. That's going to affect which pieces of information are transmitted most effectively, right? It's going to affect your ability to communicate, maybe doing chemical signals. If you're in air versus water, right? Water is going to tend to spread your chemical signals around really well, but that means that they're going to be really pretty diluted, right? It's going to be harder to find a source potentially for that chemical signal. So again, it acts really well over short distances and maybe not so much, super far away. Again, unless you have the receptors to detect things at very, very low concentrations, which of course salmon are able to do, and that's how they follow that chemical trail all the way up a river, for example. What environment you're in is going to affect what wavelengths of light are transmitted, right? Light will only penetrate about 75 to 100 meters with all the full spectrum into water. So below that, right, only certain wavelengths are going to get transmitted, and below that, nothing. So you have any light that you have in the abyss is generally generated by bioluminescent organisms, and so it's going to be very limited wavelengths of light that are generated in those particular environments. So also your interactions with other organisms are going to affect your evolutionary trajectory. It's an endless feedback loop in terms of what's relevant to an animal. So I just have to kind of think about this when we're examining animal behavior, and in particular marine birds and mammals, and ask ourselves, okay, where are they living? What kinds of stimuli are present in their environment? What would they need to be able to detect? And can they detect it? Again, it may be I need to, but I can't because I never evolved those receptors. I never had variation that allowed me to do that. Or it may be that they are able to detect information that we can't because of their evolutionary history and their current ecology that are interacting with each other, right? So being able to detect cue information from the presence of my prey would be awfully helpful, right? So again, insects, many of them see in the ultraviolet spectrum, and flowers actually have evolved to produce signals in the ultraviolet spectrum that are basically like little, beacons saying, okay, food is over here, helps attract their pollinators, which again benefits themselves because they're getting pollinated. It benefits the insect, they're getting food, so it's a nice, mutualistic relationship. But each one is affecting and being affected by the signal information that is being produced by the others, right? And of course, another example of this is the ground squirrel example we were talking about earlier, that the ground squirrels evolved to produce a signal that specifically targets the thermoreceptors in pit vipers, allowing them to look larger than they actually are and be more threatening to a pit viper than they're really able to be to other types of snakes that don't have that ability to perceive that particular part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So the environment is definitely going to affect what types of media are most relevant for an organism and the types of information that are most likely to be able to travel through that medium. It's going to help shape the form of particular signals, whether those are chemical signals or visual signals or acoustic signals, as we're going to see in the next Ed puzzle.